Hi, today I'm going to be walking you through a core skill set for financial analysis, which is setting up building blocks for your data. This is a very important skill set as it first helps indicate which set of data are relevant for your analysis, and second, it is a core tool for automation to help you solve these problems more efficiently. To go over this core skill set, we're going to be going over a case study where the instructions are all provided on the first page of the sheet. This file will be available for download on my website, and essentially what you're expected to do is using this compensation data set over here, we have to analyze how much compensation expense we've incurred by the parent departments listed here. However, the catch here is that first, the departments listed here may not be correct, and to identify the correct information, we have to use the headcount roster as the source. And second, after all these adjustments, we also have to factor in a reallocation of specific headcounts to a different cost center. Ultimately, once we've made all these adjustments, we then have to consolidate the total compensation by the correct parent cost centers. Based on these asks, this may sound a little bit complicated and you might have to set up multiple worksheets to actually get through this. However, by efficiently setting up building blocks of data, we can go through this very efficiently and in a more organized manner. And with that said, let's begin working on this case study. Now, there are multiple ways that you can tackle this case. However, the way that I'm going to tackle it is to first bring in all this compensation data into this analysis tab. And the purpose for that is to isolate the original source data and the data that I'm going to use for analysis. It's very important that you keep the source data as is so that you have traceability into what was the original file that you've received and which changes you've made afterwards to arrive to your final deliverable. Once I've made all the analysis in this tab, I'm then going to compile all the compensation expense into this consolidation tab over here. So beginning with the analysis tab, I'm going to first copy these headers. And I'm going to bring in all the compensation data over here. Let's say that on a monthly basis, I first get rid of the prior month data, and then I update it with the most recent data available. In this case, I'm going to bring in all the data set from this compensation data by using the filter formula, where column B is not empty. And let's actually copy this formatting over here. The very first thing that we have to do is first identify which cost centers are not aligned with the headcount roster. So we're going to call this rec HR, which means reconcile against headcount roster, and we'll label this black. And the very first thing that we want to do is if the department matches XLOOKUP, the employee ID, against this headcount roster here. And if it is equal, I actually want to return empty. Otherwise, I want to return the result of the XLOOKUP. And this is so that I'm able to clearly identify which ones we've adjusted as a result of this misalignment. There we go. So we can see that based on this check, we have several headcounts in which the department were different, and now we have the correct department. Next, we need to bring in the adjusted cost center. So then rec adjustment. And what we're going to do here is if countifs the employee ID equals 1, meaning that this employee ID was subjected to an adjustment, then we want to XLOOKUP the employee ID from this list here and bring in the correct department here. Otherwise, I'm going to return an empty. So we can actually see that although there was an error in the booking and we've adjusted it, we actually have to adjust it again based on this adjustment tab. So we can see from these building blocks, we actually have a hierarchy of which data supersedes the other. In this case, the adjustment tab will always take priority, and then the reconciliation against the headcount roster, and then lastly, the department. So if we actually just take a quick look here, we still do see some overlaps. However, we know that column H will always be correct. And now that we have these building blocks, we can set up a tab called Final Department or Cost Center. So in this final department, which I'm actually going to highlight red to emphasize that it is the final result. So I'm going to set up an if statement where if H5 is not empty, then return H5. And if G5 is not empty, then return G5. And then lastly, if D5 is not empty, then D5. And essentially what this formula is doing is it is first checking for the adjustment column, and if there's a value, it will always bring in the adjustment column first. However, if the adjustment column is empty, then it will check for column G, and if column G is empty, it will then bring in column D as it normally would. And if I copy this down and we filter column H for any of the non-blank values, we can see that column J accurately brought in column H as opposed to these other two departments. And once we've had that, we now have to set up one more column called Final Parent Department. And under this Final Parent Department, what we want to do is we want to bring in simply the parent department name as opposed to the full department name. And we can see from the Home tab, it did mention that the parent cost center is labeled before the colon in the cost center names. So we're going to set up a left function where we're going to search for colon and -1, and then we're just going to set up a trim to be safe. And if you're not aware of what the left function does, there are a lot of functions to help you really manipulate the data to get the information that you're looking for. And to put it in simple terms, what this formula is doing is that it is bringing in all the text right before the colon within these lists of text here. And with that said, we now have a full list of our compensation expense organized by cost centers that were adjusted based on the headcount roster and cost centers that were adjusted for based on the headcount adjustment tab. And using this information, we're now going to set up the consolidation tab. Let's first set up parent cost center like this, and then set up compensation expense. And the one tricky part here is that we need to break down the headcount information by headcounts correctly recognized and allocated based on the adjustments. It also mentions to capture the total headcount and compensation expense. So rather than just compensation, we also need to have a section for headcount. And let's bring in the parent cost centers. We're just going to use a unique formula here for simplicity's sakes. And essentially, now that we have these building blocks, we can clearly identify which ones were adjusted and which ones weren't. So we can actually set up one more column here and call it status that we can use to identify which ones are original and which ones were adjusted. And the simplest way to do this is if the final department does not equal the original department, then we'll just list adjusted, otherwise original. And if we actually filter the status for all the adjusted sections, we can see that there has at least been an adjustment either under the headcount roster or the adjustment section. And if you wanted to change the understanding of what this is asking for, meaning it doesn't want to count the ones that were fixed as a result of an error and only the ones that were adjusted, you can change this formula to just check if column H is not empty. And if column H is not empty, we can change the status to adjusted. However, in this case, we're just going to take the simple approach. And if the final department, where we're recognizing the compensation expense, is not part of the original department, then we're just going to label it adjusted for now. And for our consolidation, for our original, we're going to set up a countifs where we're going to count the status that equals original and count the final department that matches the department we're analyzing for. And we can actually just copy this over to count the ones that were adjusted. And then for the compensation expense, it is going to be almost the same thing, but instead we're going to sum the total first, where the status equals original, and the final department equals the department that we're analyzing for. And lastly, let's just set up a total. And we now have a dashboard that breaks down the headcount volumes by the ones that were original and the ones that were adjusted. And we also have compensation expense broken down by the ones that were original and adjusted. You can see how valuable it is to have these building blocks of data, because if we ever needed to review or audit which ones were adjusted, we can simply filter column M to adjusted. And if we needed to find out only the ones that were adjusted as a result of this list, we can also filter column H to remove for the blanks to see the total 36 that we've adjusted. This really helps investigations and organize all the results of your deliverable. I hope this video helped you gain insight to how to use building blocks and why they're so useful for financial analysis, and that you also download this case to try this for yourself so you could really realize the values of where these building blocks can come in handy. Always feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and follow for more educational content.